The carriage door was unlocked. This was her only chance. She was Lady Seraphina de Valois, a blue-blooded pawn being sold to settle her father's ruinous debts. Her destination? The altar, and then the bed of Gideon, the Duke of Blackwood, a man known in London, drawing rooms only by whispered rumours of cruelty and a darkness that consumed all it touched. He was a monster, a spectre, the most feared duke. But Seraphina had a secret. She would not be sold. She would run. As she gathered her skirts to jump, the carriage door swung open, but the alley was not empty. A voice, cold as the grave, met her. "Going somewhere, Duchess?" The rattle of the carriage wheels over the slick cobblestones of London was a death knell. Each clack, clack, clack was another second closer to her damnation, another link in the chain binding her to a man she had never seen, only felt through the icy terror he inspired in society. Gideon, the Duke of Blackwood. His name was never spoken above a murmur, a name associated with financial ruin, ruthless acquisitions, and a fortress in the north of England, Blackwood Manor, from which no gossip ever escaped. Lady Seraphina de Valois clutched the threadbare velvet of the carriage seat, her knuckles white. This carriage, ostentatiously painted with the Blackwood crest, a raven clutching a thorn, was alone. A cruel joke. Everything about her life had become a cruel joke. Her father, the Viscount Montaigne, had squandered their fortune, chasing phantom investments and piling up debts at gaming hells like Whites and Boodles. The man who held the final, crushing note on their ancestral home, Hawthorne Hall, was Blackwood. The bargain was simple. The Viscount's debts would be erased. Hawthorne Hall would be saved. In return, Blackwood would receive the Viscount's only presentable asset, his daughter. Seraphina's stomach churned. The cheap champagne her father had forced on her for celebration threatening to return. She wasn't just being married, she was being consumed. Her father hadn't even pretended it was a love match. "He is particular," her father, Lord Montaigne, had said, his eyes darting, his hands shaking. "He requires a wife of suitable lineage. You will do as you are told, Seraphina. You will save us." "Save you," she thought, bile rising in her throat. "You, who drank and gambled away my mother's legacy." They were approaching the outskirts of London, the city smog giving way to the damp air of the countryside. This was not the route to St. George's, Hanover Square, where the hurried, private ceremony was supposed to occur. Her father, sitting opposite her, was already half asleep, his weak chin dappled with wine stains. He was a coward, leaving her escort to the Duke's own men, two imposing, silent figures riding outside. But Seraphina was not her father. She had a plan, a desperate, foolish, razor-thin plan. For the past week, she had stitched coins and her mother's few remaining jewels, a pearl necklace, a pair of diamond earrings, into the hem of her travelling cloak. She had 50 guineas, enough to buy passage on a ship to Calais, perhaps America. Enough to become a governess, a companion, anything but the Duchess of Blackwood. She had studied the guards. They changed shifts at a posting inn just outside of London, the Griffin's Head. There would be 5 minutes of confusion as the new guards were briefed and the horses were watered. Her father, useless and drunk, would be an obstacle, but she could manage him. The carriage slowed, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. "Now." "Father," she said, her voice sharp. He snorted, blinking his bloodshot eyes open. "What? Are we there? Is the Duke here?" "The carriage has stopped, Father. I feel faint. I need air. Just a moment of air." She didn't wait for his permission. Her hand went to the brass latch. She'd tested it discreetly an hour ago. The Duke's men had not locked it from the outside. Arrogant. "Seraphina! Wait! The Duke's men!" Her father hissed, grabbing for her arm. She shoved his hand away. "Let them watch!" she cried, her voice cracking with a hysteria she hadn't realized was so close to the surface. "Let them see the bride gasping for air before she meets her jailer." She wrenched the door open and stumbled out onto the wet stones of the inn's courtyard. Rain was beginning to fall, a cold, miserable drizzle. The courtyard was chaos. Horses whinnied, stable boys shouted, and the two Blackwood guards were, just as she'd predicted, conferring with a new pair of outriders near the stables. Her father, clumsy and indignant, tumbled out after her. "Get back in! You will ruin us! You foolish, ungrateful!" His words died in a wet gurgle. Seraphina froze. Her father's eyes widened, not in anger, but in sheer, abject terror. He was staring past her into the deepest shadow of the carriageway arch. "My lord," her father choked out, sinking into a bow so low it was practically a grovel. The shadows seemed to detach themselves from the ancient stone. A figure emerged, so tall he seemed to block out the meagre light of the inn's lanterns. He was dressed not for a wedding, but in the severe, immaculate black of a man in mourning, or a predator. Rain slicked his dark hair back from a face that was all hard planes and brutal elegance. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, but he moved with a weight and finality that spoke of decades, and the rumors, for once, had not been exaggerated. A scar, white and stark, ran from his left temple, across the hard ridge of his cheekbone, and disappeared into the high collar of his coat. It gave his impossibly handsome face a terrifying asymmetry. His eyes, not black as she'd imagined, but a pale, chilling grey, the colour of a winter sea, were fixed solely on her. "A slight delay, Lord Montaigne," the man's voice rumbled. It was deep, cultivated, and utterly devoid of warmth. "No, not at all, Your Grace," her father babbled. The bride was just eager." The Duke of Blackwood took one slow step forward. He did not look at her father. He did not look at the guards, who had now snapped to attention. His gaze remained locked on Seraphina, who still stood poised for flight, her cloak clutched in her fist, the mud of the courtyard soaking the hem of her travelling dress. He saw the desperation in her stance. He saw the terror in her eyes. He saw the small, muddy bundle of her escape cloak. His lips, thin and severe, tilted in something that could never be mistaken for a smile. It was a look of grim, final victory. Gideon, the Duke of Blackwood, lifted one gloved hand, not to her, but to his men. "Secure the carriage, we are diverting." "Diverting, Your Grace?" her father squeaked. "But the bishop—" "St. George's." "The bishop," the Duke said, his voice slicing through the rain, "will meet us at Blackwood. My bride seems uncomfortable in public. I would not wish to cause her further distress." The sarcasm was a physical blow. He knew she had planned to run. He took another step, closing the distance between them. Seraphina flinched, stepping back, but her heel hit the carriage wheel. She was trapped. He stopped, barely an arm's length away. The sheer force of his presence was suffocating. He smelled of rain, leather, and something metallic, like cold steel. "You dropped this, Lady Seraphina," he said. He bent, not with a bow, but with the fluid grace of a leopard, and retrieved something from the mud by her feet. It was a single, perfect pearl, escaped from the stitching in her hem. He held it out to her on his black-gloved palm. She stared at it, her blood turning to ice. He hadn't just been waiting in the shadows. He had been watching. He had watched her plan, watched her prepare, and waited for the precise moment of her hope to curdle into despair. "Get in the carriage," he commanded. It was not a request. Seraphina looked from the pearl to the dark, imposing fortress of the man. She looked at her trembling, useless father. She looked at the guards, who were now posted at the inn's only exit. There was no escape. The alley was not empty. The shadows had been waiting for her all along. With a sob of pure, undiluted defeat, she turned, her shoulders slumped, and climbed back into the gilded cage. The Duke of Blackwood followed her in, and the heavy thud of the door sealing them inside was the sound of her world ending. The interior of the carriage, which had seemed merely oppressive before, now felt like a tomb. The Duke of Blackwood took the seat opposite her, the one her father had occupied. Lord Montaigne, dismissed with a curt nod from Blackwood, was scrambling into a different carriage behind them, no doubt relieved to be free of the suffocating tension. They were alone. Seraphina pressed herself into the corner, as far from him as the confines would allow. She stared resolutely out the window, watching the rain-lashed courtyard of the Griffin's Head fall away. She would not look at him. She would not speak to him. She would give him nothing. For miles, the only sounds were the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof, the jingle of the harness, and the steady breathing of the man opposite her. The silence was a weapon, and he wielded it with surgical precision. It stretched, tightened, and became more terrifying than any threat. She could feel his gaze on her. It was not the leering gaze of a rake or the dismissive glance of an aristocrat. It was analytical. He was watching her the way a scientist might study an insect, or a general might study a map of enemy territory. Finally, she could bear it no longer. Her defiance, born of sheer terror, snapped. "Why?" she whispered, the word torn from her throat. The Duke's head tilted slightly. "Why what, Lady Seraphina? Why? This abduction, the humiliation. You knew I was trying to leave. Why stop me? Why not just let me go and demand my father's ruin? It is what you are owed." His pale grey eyes shuttered. "You believe I am owed Hawthorne Hall? You are owed the debt. Take the house. Take the lands. What use do you have for me?" He leaned forward slightly. The carriage, though spacious, suddenly felt airless. "Hawthorne Hall is a crumbling relic, waterlogged and poorly managed. Your father's lands are mortgaged to 3 different lenders, including a Mr. Thomas Abernathy, who holds paper on everything down to the silver. The house is worthless. The debt is worthless." Seraphina's stomach hollowed out. "Then, why?" "Because, Duchess," he said, the title striking her like a slap, "your father, in his infinite wisdom, offered a different collateral, a clause in your marriage contract. Should you fail to appear at the altar, should you flee, abscond, or otherwise break the agreement, the debt is not voided. It is transferred. To you." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "Transferred? You would not owe me your hand in marriage. You would owe me £80,000, personally. A debt I would be legally entitled to collect by any means necessary. Seizure of property, or failing that, debtor's prison." Seraphina went cold. The fleet. She had read pamphlets about it. The filth, the disease, the degradation. A high-born lady would not last a week. "My father would not," she breathed, but the words were hollow. She knew he would. He had saved his own skin and signed her death warrant in the same stroke. "He would," Gideon stated, his voice flat, confirming her worst fear. "He did. The contract was signed and witnessed by Mr. Abernathy himself 2 days ago." Her escape plan. It was never an escape. It was a trap. If she ran, she was imprisoned. If she stayed, she was married to him. "So you stopped me," she said, her voice numb, "to save me from prison?" A dark, mirthless chuckle escaped him. Do not mistake me for a savior, Lady Seraphina. I am a businessman. I came to collect what I am owed. Your father offered me a bankrupt estate or a wife of high standing. I chose the one with quantifiable value. Value? She spat. You mean a brood mare? Someone to provide the Blackwood air you so clearly require. For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed his scarred face. It was not anger. It was something colder, sharper. The Blackwood line, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, needs no heir from you. The terms of our arrangement are simple. You will be my Duchess. You will reside at Blackwood. You will attend the functions I deem necessary. You will be civil. In return, your father's debts are nullified, and you will live in a comfort you haven't known for a decade. And in private? She forced herself to ask, her skin crawling. In private, the Duke said, turning his gaze to the window. We shall be strangers. My quarters are in the west wing. Yours will be in the east. You will not come to my wing. I will not come to yours. Is that clear? Seraphina was stunned into silence. This was not the brute she had imagined. The rumors spoke of cruelty, of a man who devoured women, of a first wife who had— "What of your first wife?" she blurted out, the words escaping before she could stop them. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The air in the carriage dropped 20 degrees. The Duke of Blackwood turned his head slowly back toward her. The analytical gaze was gone, replaced by a glacial fury that stole the breath from her lungs. You will never, he bit out, each word a chip of ice, mention her name. You will not ask the staff about her. You will not speak of her. You will not think of her. She is of no concern to you. But people say— People, he interrupted, his voice a low, lethal growl, are fools who chatter in drawing rooms. You are now the Duchess of Blackwood. You are not people. You will learn silence, or you will learn to regret opening your mouth. He leaned back, the mask of cold indifference slamming back into place, but the violence of his warning lingered in the air like poison. Seraphina shrank back into the corner, her heart pounding. This was not a reprieve. This was a different kind in prison. A cold, silent one, ruled by a man who was not a leering brute, but something far more dangerous. A man of absolute, chilling control, haunted by ghosts she was forbidden to acknowledge. The journey north lasted 2 days. They stopped at immaculate, expensive inns, where the proprietors bowed and scraped, their eyes wide with fear and awe of the Duke. He spoke to her only to issue commands. We will dine in half an hour. Be ready to leave at dawn. She ate, she slept. She rode in silence, a beautifully dressed automaton. She was no longer Seraphina de Valois. She was a possession, a quantifiable value. As the manicured fields of the south gave way to the rolling, desolate hills of Northumberland, the landscape itself seemed to reflect her state of mind. The sky was a bruised purple, the trees were bare-knuckled skeletons, and a wind howled over the moors, crying a lonely, unending lament. Late on the third night, the carriage began a steep ascent. Through the mist and rain, she saw it. Blackwood Manor. It was not a manor. It was a fortress, perched on a cliff overlooking the churning, black water of the North Sea. It was a monolith of dark grey stone, stark and brutal against the skyline. It was less a home than a declaration of war against the landscape and against hope itself. The carriage rumbled through a massive iron gate, the screech of the hinges echoing in the night. It stopped in a vast, torch-lit courtyard. A footman, pale and silent, opened the door. The Duke descended first. He did not offer her a hand. He simply waited. Trembling, Seraphina gathered her skirts and stepped out onto the slick stone. The wind tore at her cloak, whipping her hair across her face. She looked up at the towering, lightless facade of her new home. "Welcome to Blackwood, Duchess," the Duke's voice said from beside her. She turned to him. The torchlight threw an infernal glow onto his scarred face. "It is not my home," she said, her voice small but fierce. "It is my prison." "Prisons," he replied, his gaze unreadable as he stared up at the highest tower, "are often of our own making. Or in your case, your father's." He turned and walked up the massive stone steps, not waiting to see if she followed. Seraphina stood alone in the courtyard, the cold rain starting to soak through her cloak, a lone, shivering figure before the gates of hell. A woman was waiting for them in the great hall, which was so vast and shadowed, it seemed to swallow the light from the massive fireplace. The woman was older, dressed in severe black bombazine, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at her very skull. Her face was a mask of rigid propriety. "Your Grace," she said, dipping into a curtsy as the Duke entered. Her eyes flicked to Seraphina, assessing and cold. "My lady." "Mrs. Davies," Gideon said, stripping off his wet gloves. "This is the Duchess. She will be taking the East Wing. Have her rooms prepared." "They are already prepared, Your Grace, as you instructed." "Good." He didn't spare Seraphina another glance. "I will be in my study. I am not to be disturbed." He vanished down a dark, wood-panelled corridor, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor until they were consumed by the oppressive silence of the house. Seraphina was left standing in the center of the hall, dripping onto the floor, feeling like a piece of luggage that had just been delivered. Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, stared at her. The silence stretched. "If you will follow me, my lady." Mrs. Davies led her up a staircase, wide enough to accommodate a carriage, the walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes all seemingly following her. The air in the house was frigid, carrying the damp, mineral smell of old stone and sea spray. "The East Wing has been unoccupied for some time," Mrs. Davies said, her voice devoid of inflection. "His Grace thought you would prefer the privacy." Privacy, Seraphina thought, or isolation. The wing was, indeed, private. It was separated from the main house by a long, vaulted gallery. The rooms, when Mrs. Davies pushed open the heavy oak door, were magnificent. A huge sitting room, a cavernous bedchamber, and a dressing room, all furnished with exquisite, if dated, French furniture. A fire roared in the hearth, but it did little to combat the profound chill of the room. "Your trunks have arrived. A girl, Mary, will be assigned to you. She will draw you a bath. Dinner will be served in your rooms at 8. "I will not be dining with the Duke?" Seraphina asked, though she already knew the answer. "His Grace," Mrs. Davies replied, her expression unchanging, "dines alone, always." She curtsied again, her back rigid, and departed, closing the door with a soft, final click. Seraphina stood in the center of the vast, opulent room. She was a duchess. She was the mistress of this mausoleum, and she had never felt so utterly, terrifyingly alone. The next days bled into a routine of profound emptiness. She woke. She was attended by the terrified, silent maid, Mary, who seemed afraid to even make eye contact. She ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner alone, served in her rooms on heavy silver trays. She did not see the Duke. She was a ghost in her own life. On the 4th day, the crushing monotony, combined with the persistent, howling wind outside, drove her from her gilded cage. She had to move. She had to see. She left the East Wing and began to explore. Blackwood Manor was a labyrinth. It was a place of endless corridors, locked doors, and rooms shrouded in dust cloths their furniture skeletal and haunting in the grey light. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ticking of a dozen grandfather clocks, all slightly out of sync, creating a disquieting, skittering heartbeat within the house. The staff, when she encountered them, were as silent and pale as the maids. They would flatten themselves against the wall, eyes downcast, and murmur, "My lady," until she passed. They were terrified. Not of her, she realized. Of him. She found the library. It was 2 stories tall, filled with thousands of books. But it was cold, the fireplace empty. She found a ballroom, its chandeliers draped in white shrouds, a dance floor waiting for dancers who would never come. And she found the West Wing. It was structurally identical to her own, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where her wing felt abandoned, this one felt occupied. There was a faint scent of tobacco and leather in the air. A fire burned. But as she took a step toward the main corridor, Mrs. Davies materialized from a side passage, as if summoned. "My lady, you are lost." It was not a question. "I was exploring," Seraphina said, trying to sound casual. "The West Wing is His Grace's private domain," as he explained. The housekeeper's voice was still flat, but there was an underlying warning, sharp as steel. "He is my husband," Seraphina countered, a spark of defiance rising. "He is the Duke, madam, and he requires solitude." Mrs. Davies stood, an unmovable sentinel in black bombazine, blocking the path. Defeated, Seraphina turned back. That night, sleep would not come. The wind shrieked around the stone mullions of her window, sounding like a woman screaming. She tossed and turned, the heavy silk sheets feeling like a shroud. "What of your first wife?" "You will never mention her name." Why? What had happened to her? Unable to rest, she rose, pulling on a dressing gown. She needed a book, something to distract her from the sound of the wind and the chill in her heart. She lit a candelabra and made her way back through the sleeping house to the library. The massive room was even more intimidating at night. The portraits of the Blackwood ancestors seemed to watch her every move. She pulled a volume of poetry from a shelf and turned to leave. A sound stopped her. A low, agonized groan. It came from the floor above, from the gallery that ran along the second level of the library. Her heart leapt into her throat. Was someone injured? She crept up the spiral staircase at the far end of the room, her candle flame guttering in the draught. "Hello?" she whispered. The sound came again. A choked, harsh sound, as if someone were fighting for breath. She rounded the corner of the shelves and froze. It was him. The Duke. He was not in his study. He was here, in a small alcove lined with books on military strategy. He was slumped in a high-backed chair, his back to her. He was not wearing his coat, and his white shirt was dark with something. At first, she thought it was shadow, but as she drew closer, the metallic scent hit her. Blood. He was bleeding. "Your Grace," she breathed, her terror momentarily eclipsed by shock. He didn't move. She stepped closer, holding the candle high. It wasn't his blood. A dead pheasant lay on the floor at his feet, its neck clearly wrung. On the table beside him was a hunting knife, stained dark, and a bottle of brandy, half empty. But he was not fine. He was rigid, his hands clenched on the arms of the chair, his head bowed. He was breathing in short, harsh gasps, his entire body trembling as if gripped by a violent ache. "Your Grace! Gideon!" she said, louder this time. He snapped upright, his head whipping around. His face, in the wavering candlelight, was unrecognizable. The mask of cold control was utterly gone. This was not the feared Duke. This was a man in hell. His eyes were wide, vacant, and filled with a terror so profound it stopped her heart. He was looking at her, but he was not seeing her. He was seeing something else, something from his past. "No," he whispered, his voice raw. "Leave. Leave him. The flank. They're through the flank. Get back. Get back." He lunged, not at her, but at the empty space beside her, shoving an imaginary soldier out of the way. He stumbled, catching himself on the bookshelf, his breath tearing from his lungs in a sob. Seraphina realized the truth. He was not drunk. He was not mad. He was back in the war. The rumors. They said he had been a hero at Waterloo, that he had led a charge, that he was ruthless, fearless. They never mentioned the cost. "Your Grace," she said, her voice soft now, gentle. "You are not there. You are at Blackwood. You are in the library." He blinked, his eyes struggling to focus on her. The phantom gunfire faded from his gaze, replaced by a dawning, agonizing confusion. He looked at her, at the candle in her hand, at the books around them. "Seraphina," he breathed, her name sounding foreign and rough on his tongue. The terror receded, but what replaced it was, in its own way, worse. A wave of profound, bone-deep shame. He straightened, his trembling hands balling into fists at his sides. He was suddenly aware of his disarray, of the dead bird, of her presence. The mask of the Duke slammed back into place, but it was cracked. She had seen behind it. "I told you," he snarled, his voice thick, "that my wing, that my time, was my own." "I heard a noise," she said, refusing to back down, her pity warring with her fear. "I thought you were hurt." "I am not hurt." He gestured to the bird. "I was hunting. At 3 a.m, in the library?" His grey eyes flashed with a dangerous fire. "Get out!" "You are unwell," she insisted, taking a step toward him. "You are suffering what I am," he said, stepping toward her, his height and his fury suddenly overwhelming. "Is not your concern. You are my Duchess in name. You are not my wife. You are not my confessor. You have no place here. Go back to your wing. Do not ever speak of what you saw tonight. Not to me, not to Mrs. Davies, not to God himself. Is that understood?" She stared at him, at the raw pain warring with the cold fury in his eyes. The man who was feared by all of London was, she realized, terrified. He was a prisoner here, just as she was, a prisoner of his own mind. Wordlessly she nodded. She turned and fled, her candle painting frantic, dancing shadows on the walls as she ran back to the cold safety of the East Wing. But she could not escape the image of his face, stripped bare of its defenses. And she could not escape the horrifying new reality. The monster she had been forced to marry was broken. The incident in the library changed nothing, and yet it changed everything. On the surface, their silent, separate lives continued. She did not see him. He did not summon her. The house remained a fortress of cold civility and unspoken dread. Mrs. Davies and the staff continued to glide through the halls like pale spectres, their faces blank. But Seraphina could no longer see the Duke as a mere monster. She had seen the fractured man beneath the scar, the nightmares, for that is what she knew it must have been. A waking terror from his past as a soldier haunted her. She found herself looking at the books on war in the library, wondering what he had seen, what he had done. She also found herself angry, not just at her father, but at the world that had broken this man and then whispered about him in salons, turning his trauma into a titillating rumor of cruelty. A week after her arrival, a letter arrived on a silver tray. It was not from her father. She had neither written to him nor expected to hear from him. The parchment was thick, the handwriting an aggressive masculine scrawl. It was not a letter. It was a summons. "Duchess, you will join me for dinner. Tonight, 8 o'clock, the main dining hall. Blackwood." No request, just a command. Her first instinct was fear, a cold prickle down her spine. He was breaking their routine. Why? Was he going to punish her for what she saw? Her second instinct was defiance. She was tired of being a ghost. She was tired of being afraid. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. If he wanted to dine with her, then he would get the Duchess. She spent the afternoon preparing. She instructed the terrified maid, Mary, to draw a hot bath and lay out her finest gown, a deep emerald velvet that had been part of her trousseau. It was daringly cut, a style favoured in London, designed to be seen. She coiled her hair on her head, leaving a few tendrils to curl at her neck. She affixed her mother's pearl earrings, the only jewellery she had left after her failed escape. When she descended the grand staircase at 8 o'clock, she was no longer a frightened girl. She was a woman armoured in velvet and pearls. He was already there, standing before the fireplace in the cavernous dining hall. The table, long enough to seat 40, was set for only 2 at opposite ends, a vast, polished mahogany desert between them. He turned as she entered. His pale gaze swept over her, from her hair down to the hem of her gown. It was, as always, analytical, but she detected something new. A flicker of surprise. He had expected the trembling girl from the carriage, not this poised woman. "Duchess," he said, inclining his head, "you are punctual." "You commanded it, Your Grace," she replied, her voice cool. "I assumed punctuality was required." A footman, his hands trembling slightly, pulled out her chair. She sat. The Duke took his seat at the far end. The distance was comical, a farce of intimacy. The soup was served. The silence of the house pressed in, amplifying the sound of their spoons against the porcelain. "You have been exploring," he stated. It was not a question. Serapha's hand tightened on her spoon. "The house is large. I have ample time. You find it to your liking. I find it cold, Your Grace. But the library is extensive. You are a reader. I am a prisoner, Duke. Reading is one of the few freedoms you have allowed me." He placed his spoon down. The small clink echoed in the vast room. "We must be clear on something, Lady Seraphina. You are not a prisoner. A prisoner has some hope of release. You do not." The cruelty of the statement was so bald, so direct, it took her breath away. "Then I am a slave," she countered, her voice shaking despite her resolve. "You are a duchess," he shot back, his voice rising for the first time. "You are the mistress of one of the largest fortunes in England. You have gowns, jewels, food and protection. Do not equate your gilded cage with the suffering of true slaves. It is an insult to their pain and an exaggeration of your own." She recoiled, stung. "Protection? Protection from what? The world is afraid of you. Who, precisely, is protecting me from my protector?" He stared at her, his jaw tight, the scar on his cheek standing out white against his suddenly pale skin. The footmen, sensing the rising storm, had frozen near the sideboard. "You have no idea," he said, his voice dangerously low, "what I have protected you from. You, in your naive world of London balls and society gossip. You think you understand power? You think you understand debt? I understand my father sold me to you." "He did," Gideon agreed, leaning forward. "But did you ever ask yourself why I accepted the bargain? I told you your father's estate was worthless. It was the truth. You said I was a quantifiable value, a high-born wife. A convenient story, and one I allowed you to believe. The main course was served, a roasted pheasant, ironically. Seraphina stared at it, her stomach churning. "I do not understand," she whispered. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound, and pushed his plate away, his meal untouched. "No, you do not. That is why I summoned you tonight. Your education must begin." He signaled to the footman. "Leave us." The staff vanished, grateful for the reprieve. "Your father, Seraphina," the Duke began, his voice taking on a cold, clinical tone, did not merely gamble away his fortune at White's. He fell in with a different crowd, a crowd led by a man named Lord Piers Montgomery. Seraphina knew the name. Lord Piers, a man with a devastating smile, rumoured to be impossibly wealthy, but with no discernible estate. He was a darling of the ton. "Lord Piers is a friend of the Prince Regent," she said, confused. "Lord Piers," Gideon corrected, "is a parasite. He runs a consortium that preys on desperate men. Your father was one of them. He loaned your father money at impossible interest. When your father couldn't pay, Piers offered him another solution. He could invest in a new venture." A venture? Smuggling, but not just brandy and silk. Weapons, French weapons, sold to radicals in the northern counties. Treason, Duchess. Your father, in his desperation, signed on. Seraphina felt the blood drain from her face. "No, he is weak, but he is not a traitor. He is whatever Lord Piers tells him to be." The operation was financed by a silent partner, a lawyer who laundered the money and provided the contracts, a man named Thomas Abernathy. The name hit her. Mr. Abernathy, our family solicitor, the man who witnessed my marriage contract. "The very same," Gideon confirmed. "The contract that would have sent you to debtor's prison was Abernathy's invention. A neat little trap. If you married me, I would be tied to a family steeped in treason. If you ran, you would be imprisoned, silenced, and destroyed, your reputation in tatters, leaving your father free to continue his work." She was dizzy, the room tilting. "But why you? Why marry me to you?" "Because," Gideon said, and now his eyes were like chips of ice. "I have been hunting Lord Piers for 3 years. I have been dismantling his operations, piece by piece. He and Abernathy thought to ensnare me, to use my reputation as a shield. They thought I would be so distracted by my new, beautiful bride that I would not see the knife at my back. They thought my marriage to a traitor's daughter would discredit any accusations I made." He paused, and the weight of his next words settled on her. "They severely underestimated me. So, this marriage," she breathed, "it wasn't to acquire me. It was a move. In your game. It was a complication I had not anticipated. But when your father offered you, I saw the truth. They were not just trapping me. They were disposing of you. You were a loose end. A potential witness. A liability." He rose from his chair and walked the long distance of the table until he was standing behind her. She tensed, her hands gripping the tablecloth. He did not touch her. He just stood there, his presence a heavy weight. "I did not stop you at the Griffin's Head to save you from prison, Seraphina. I stopped you because Lord Piers' men were waiting in the next alley. They were not going to take you to Calais. They were going to take you to the bottom of the Thames." The room went silent. The only sound was the frantic, terrified hammering of her own heart. The shadows she had seen, they hadn't been his men. They had been his. "You are safer here as my Duchess than you have ever been in your life," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "You are in a fortress, but know this, the vipers your father allied himself with are not gone. They are merely waiting, and they now see you not as a liability, but as my only weakness. He walked back to his end of the table. "Eat your dinner, Duchess. You will need your strength. The game is far from over." The Duke's revelation shattered Seraphina's world. She was not a pawn in a game of debt. She was a hostage in a war. Her father was not just weak. He was a criminal, a traitor, and the man she had been forced to marry, the most feared Duke, was her protector. This new reality was more terrifying than the old one. Before, she had only her husband to fear. Now she feared the entire world outside Blackwood's walls. The wind howling at the windows no longer sounded like a wailing woman. It sounded like the threats of Lord Piers Montgomery. Gideon retreated back into his silence. They did not dine together again, but the atmosphere in the house had shifted. When she saw him, a rare glimpse of his tall figure crossing the great hall or riding out on a massive black stallion, his gaze would meet hers. It was no longer cold, but waited, acknowledging. They were allies, bound not by affection, but by a shared, mortal danger. Her isolation, however, felt more profound. She was safe, but she was still caged. She began to spend more time with the only other person in the house who seemed to live in a world of secrets. Mrs. Davies. The housekeeper was, as ever, rigid and formal. But Seraphina, emboldened by her new knowledge, began to push. "You have served the Duke for a long time, Mrs. Davies?" she asked one afternoon, finding the housekeeper supervising the polishing of silver in the dining hall. "I have served the Blackwood family since I was a girl, my lady. I served his father, the old Duke." "So you knew? You knew his first wife? Isabella?" The air stilled. The footman polishing a goblet froze, his eyes wide. Mrs. Davies turned slowly. Her face was as pale as marble. "His Grace's orders are clear. We do not speak of her." "His Grace is not here," Seraphina pressed, her voice gentle. "I am not idle gossip, Mrs. Davies. I am his wife. I live in this house. I wish to understand." The housekeeper's lips thinned. She stared at Seraphina for a long, agonizing moment. "Understanding," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "brings only pain here, my lady. Please, the rumors in London, they are cruel. They say he was responsible." A sound, half gasp, half sob, escaped the housekeeper. "He was responsible," Mrs. Davies whispered, her iron control cracking. "He was responsible for bringing her here." She turned, her hands twisting in her black apron. "She was not like you, my lady. She was fragile, all laughter and light. From Italy. She hated the cold. She hated the sea. This house, it terrified her." "What happened to her?" Seraphina asked, her heart aching. She fell," Mrs. Davies said, her eyes fixed on the rain-lashed window. "From the cliffs, the ones below the old East Tower." "The East Tower? That's part of my wing. It is locked, my lady. It has been locked for 5 years." "Was it an accident?" Mrs. Davies looked at her, and Seraphina saw something in her eyes that chilled her to the bone. Pure, unadulterated hatred. But it was not directed at Seraphina. It was not even directed at the Duke. "Lady Isabella," the housekeeper said, her voice regaining its flat, hard edge, "was terrified of heights. She would never have gone near the cliffs. Not alone." She turned back to the silver. "The matter is closed, my lady. It was an accident. The coroner ruled it so." But Seraphina knew a dismissal when she heard one. She would never have gone near the cliffs. That night, Seraphina didn't sleep. She waited until the house was deep in the grip of silence, the clocks chiming 2. She lit her candelabra and went not to the library, but to the end of her own corridor in the east wing. There it was. A heavy, iron-strapped door. It was, as Mrs. Davies had said, locked. A massive rusted padlock secured it. This was Isabella's wing, she realized. He didn't put me here for privacy. He put me here as a replacement. The thought was sickening. She examined the lock. It was old, but the wall beside it, the stone, was darker in one spot. She ran her fingers over it. A sconce. She tugged it. Nothing. She pushed it. It didn't budge. She lifted it. With a faint scrape of stone on stone, the sconce shifted, and a small, hollow cavity was revealed behind it. Inside, covered in dust, was a large iron key. Her hand trembled as she took it. It was meant to be found. But by whom? She put the key in the ancient padlock. It was stiff, protesting with a groan of metal, but finally it turned. The heavy lock fell into her hand. She pulled the bar, and the heavy door swung open on creaking hinges, releasing a gust of air that smelled of dust, sea salt, and old dried flowers. She stepped inside. This was the East Tower. It was not a suite of rooms. It was a single, vast, circular chamber, exactly as it had been left 5 years ago. It was a lady's sitting room, but a lady of light and warmth. The furniture was delicate, upholstered in pale blues and yellows. An embroidery frame stood in the corner, a needle still trailing blue thread. A portrait above the mantelpiece showed a beautiful, dark-haired woman with a vivacious smile. Isabella. But the room was a scene of devastation. A chair was overturned. A vase of dried flowers was shattered on the floor. And the window, the great, arched window that overlooked the cliffs, was wide open, its curtains flapping wildly in the wind, letting the rain soak the floor. A small, elegant writing desk stood near the window. On it, an inkwell was tipped over, a black stain spreading across the wood. A single sheet of parchment lay beneath it, weighted down by a crystal paperweight. Seraphina crossed the room, her heart pounding. She lifted the paperweight. The note was addressed to no one. The handwriting was frantic, splattered with ink, and was that a tear stain? He knows. He found the letters. He said I would be ruined, that he would tell the Duke. He is a monster, a smiling, charming monster. He is here. He is at the door. I will not let him. I will not. The note ended there, in a long, jagged streak of ink, as if the pen had been torn from her hand. Seraphina reread the words, her blood running cold. He knows. He found the letters. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't suicide. He is a monster, a smiling, charming monster. She remembered Gideon's words at dinner. Lord Piers Montgomery, a parasite, a darling of the ton. Oh God, Seraphina whispered. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on the fireplace. Tucked into the hearth, unburned, was a small, leather-bound journal. She snatched it up. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely open it. It was Isabella's diary. She read, her horror growing with every page. Isabella had been lonely. She had been miserable. And she had been foolish. She had started a correspondence with a sympathetic gentleman from London who had visited Blackwood once. A man who listened to her, who flattered her, who charmed her. Lord Piers Montgomery. The correspondence had been innocent at first, but Piers had twisted it, implying an affair, threatening to show the Duke, who he knew was away at war. He was blackmailing her. The last entry was dated the day she died. Piers is here. He arrived unexpectedly. Gideon is due back tomorrow. Piers says I must pay him, or he will show Gideon the letters and paint me as an adulteress. He says Gideon's pride will not survive it, that he will kill me. But Piers, his eyes, he is the one I fear. He is coming to the tower. I will not. Seraphina dropped the diary. It was murder. Piers had murdered Isabella. He had staged it as a suicide, a fall from the cliffs, and Gideon. Gideon had returned from the war, from one hell to another. He had returned to find his wife dead, and the world whispering that his coldness had driven her to it. The night he had the nightmare, the bird, he had just returned from hunting, the agony she saw. It wasn't just the war, it was this, the guilt, the shame, the failure to protect his wife. Mrs. Davies, Seraphina said, the name clicking into place, the housekeeper's hatred. He was responsible for bringing her here. She hadn't meant the Duke, she meant Piers. A new, terrifying thought struck her. Gideon had been hunting Piers for 3 years. He'd said it was about treason, about weapons. But it wasn't. Not really. This was not about politics. This was not about debt. This was about revenge. And Seraphina, now in possession of the one thing that could prove it, was standing squarely in the middle of it. Armed with Isabella's diary, Seraphina felt a new, protective rage. She broke the cardinal rule and burst into Gideon's study, finding him exhausted. Before he could admonish her, she threw the diary on his desk. She didn't fall, Seraphina declared. He murdered her. Gideon's fury turned to agony as he read the proof he'd lacked for 5 years. He exploded in grief, weeping for returning from Waterloo too late. As he broke down, Seraphina comforted him, refusing his claim that he was poison and insisting they now had the proof to destroy Piers. Their new alliance was shattered by shouting. In the great hall, Lord Piers Montgomery had arrived, his men drawing pistols, demanding Seraphina as collateral. But Gideon sprung his trap. 10 of his own armed soldiers emerged from the shadows. Gideon revealed that Seraphina's father and Mr. Abernathy were already captured. Cornered, Piers lunged for Seraphina. Gideon moved like a soldier, knocking him out with a single, brutal punch. As his men dragged Piers away, Gideon turned to Seraphina, took her hand, and kissed her palm, his voice thick. "It's over." "No," she whispered, lacing her fingers with his. "We are safe." The king's men arrived at dawn, taking Piers Montgomery away in chains. The conspiracy was broken, and Gideon, once feared, was now hailed as a hero. As a profound quiet settled over Blackwood, the oppressive shadows of the past finally lifted, the house feeling lighter than it had in years. Gideon found Seraphina in the great hall. He told her the danger was gone. "You are free," he said, his voice rough. He offered her wealth, independence, and passage to London or America, releasing her completely from their bargain. But Seraphina looked at the man who had saved her life multiple times. "You are offering me freedom," she said, "but I find I do not want it." She refused to leave, gently challenging the darkness he saw in himself. "You are not a monster, Gideon. You have just been alone for far too long." He stared at her, stunned, the articulate Duke lost for words. I do not know how to be anything else," he stammered. "Then we shall find out," she whispered, stepping toward him. "Together." He bent his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, shattering relief. The kiss of 2 prisoners finally setting each other free. "The shadows," he murmured against her skin. "They are gone." Seraphina held him, looking at the sunlight streaming through the windows. "Yes," she said. "And look, Gideon, the sun is rising." And so, the shadows of Blackwood Manor finally receded, not burned away by a grand passion, but pushed back by the quiet, resilient light of 2 people who chose to see the truth in each other. The most feared Duke was never a monster, but a guardian. And the woman who tried to flee her cage became the one who held the key. Theirs was not a story that began with a kiss, but one that ended with a choice: to face the dawn together. What did you think of Seraphina's and Gideon's journey? It just goes to show that the shadows we fear most are often the ones created by a light we haven't seen yet. If you loved this story of drama, mystery, and historical romance, please hit that like button. It truly helps this channel grow. Share this video with a friend who needs a new story to get lost in. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story. Thank you for listening.